Hi and welcome to Nurture Your Zest. I'm your host, Ashleigh King, and I will bring you a wealth of interesting people with fascinating ideas across the tech industries, the creative industries, and also uplifting stories of courage and hope. We all go through prickly situations in life. I believe that through courage, creativity, and curiosity, you can find inspiration to nurture your zest. That thing that gets you up and out of bed every morning, the thing that lifts you up and lights up your day. So join me in the studio and let's see who we have in the hot seat today. Hello and welcome to Nurture Your Zest. I'm so excited to have Tamma Carel with me today. As a fellow South African, it's awesome to have somebody from home to chat to. So welcome, Tam.
Thank you very much, Ashleigh. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And I guess I should say, how's it, my doll?
It's very good. Bye, Aleka. Bye, Aleka.
So, yeah, isn't it wild that we two South African girls that ended up in the UK?
And met in Newcastle, a very, very long way away from home.
I know. So it was about 5 years ago at Paul Lancaster's Newcastle Startup Week, right?
It was, yes.
And what a cool event. And it's coming back, which is fun.
We will be there.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting watching your journey, as I'm sure you'll say about mine too. We've both come a really long way. We've pivoted. We've grown, you've won awards, you've done a TEDx talk. There's been a lot of stuff going on,
Wild
right?
ride.
So we can talk about that today and whatever else. But I'm really happy to have you here today because one of the things that I love on the show is to talk about encouraging stories, inspiring stories, but also things that will help people to think. And you are an environmental scientist. And a specialist in that field, and it's something I'm really concerned about and I'd like to talk about. So there's loads we can chat about today. Before we do that, can we do a deep dive into Tam? Like, who's Tamma?
Who's Tamma? So I was born and raised in South Africa. I come from a family of kind of game rangers, conservation specialists, and fishermen. Quite a generational history of fishing, actually. So grew up, literally in nature, kind of the wilder side of South Africa, whilst attending school in Johannesburg, which is completely different. That's kind of a metropolitan city, not very wild at all, although maybe wild in a different way.
In like massive crime.
Yeah, and chaos and a lot of people. But obviously kind of growing up in South Africa and having that connection with nature, I feel like there were some lessons that were instilled from childhood that I probably took for granted until I left South Africa. So I moved to the UK in 2002 with my family. At the time I was 14. So I moved just at the time to do my GCSEs. And my A-levels, which I actually did in Lincolnshire before coming to Newcastle for university in 2006 and then never leaving because I love it here so much. But it was really kind of moving away from South Africa to, England, which from what I'd seen on the telly and what Hollywood had portrayed was a very developed country, a very different lifestyle. My parents actually moved us to rural Lincolnshire. We lived in a hamlet with 8 houses. We were like a 20-minute drive from the nearest bus station. And their logic was, having come from South Africa and having had, so much space that we took for granted, if they put us in the middle of London, we'd probably suffocate. We wouldn't have adapted well to that. However, it also meant I had a very naive perspective of what England was like, because for the first 4 years, I lived in rural Lincolnshire with literally nobody around. And I thought that was perfectly normal. Being in the countryside, though, what I did become very aware of was the lack of nature. There was some deer, there was some foxes, there was some badgers, and that was it. And then moved to Newcastle and realized there was a city and close to the ocean, and that kind of, brought about a different life. And I'm very grateful for where we are because of the access to nature. I've known my whole life I was going to do an environmental job. Actually, that's not true. Day one ambition was to grow up to be a mermaid. I was absolutely convinced that I needed to live in the sea and I would look after all the fishes and I would just live, a happy life, sploshing around, living my best mermaid life. And unfortunately, that's not a viable career option, although I'm still working on it.
I want to stop you there because I used to work on a festival some years ago and they used to hire like performers
Like
who would dance around the lake in mermaid tails, for real.
Oh, well, that's my plan B
So
then. If all of this goes to pot,
you can totally go and
I
dance.
shall be a dancing mermaid.
I mean, it was amazing. They would just wear like, well, you've already got long hair, so yeah, you just wear your little outfit and wear the tail. And there's also various, you know how people can niche into different communities of all kinds. So what's that live action role play? Is it LARPing?
Yeah.
So there are groups that will go and do mermaid swims. So
you
it's
just
a
need
real
to figure
thing.
out how to monetize this, and then there's hope. And then there's hope.
Exactly. Maybe mermaids for climate change who like clean the
I
oceans or
love
something.
this.
That would be quite a fun event to do, and just like a one-off to raise some money. So I want to chat about South Africa quick, because I feel such a kinship with you and a bit of a parallel life sometimes, because you moved to the UK at 14, as did I. Also went straight into my GCSEs. I often think I wish I'd come, and when we arrived, maybe gone into year 9, I feel like the academic opportunities were very limited because there was this perception of where South Africa was academically. So I was put in like...
It was quite a battle, and we were in the bottom set for everything, kind of convinced we couldn't speak English or, basic maths or anything like that. So you had to prove yourself, didn't you? Like from day one.
Yeah, and like I remember my first class was French. So it's like...
Hadn't done French.
Never done French.
Zulu, Afrikaans, Hebrew.
Exactly. So
none of which are helpful in
I had Xhosa and a bit of Sotho and Shona and a bit of Zulu. And then you move here and it's like people are speaking German and French and Spanish, and it's hard. Like especially first lesson, like being taught by a Geordie a Geordie accent, French, but in a school in Sunderland. It was just like, whoa, wait, what's going on? So I think I do feel that kinship with you. I feel a similar journey, and I think for anybody who's never immigrated to a different country, people immigrate for lots of reasons, and people have all kinds of thoughts about immigration and should we do it or shouldn't we do it. I think sometimes when you're kids, it's not your choice, and you kind of have to go where your family's going, and sometimes we're leaving stuff that we need to leave behind. So I really do feel a kinship with you on that, and I, like you, miss home, but then we've created a different version of home, right? So I did want to ask, you moved to rural Lincolnshire, and I find that so funny. So I moved to Sunderland when I first came to the UK, and one of the things that astounded me was I thought the UK was going to be tea and cucumber sandwiches with the Queen, and
everyone
Paddington.
speaks the scones English, the Queen's English.
Yeah, the scones English. I like that.
English.
But what I found really strange was it was a bit more like Billy Elliot, like the film, with County Durham and like that type of thing. I found the whole, it was like a different world. And I remember as well, school was quite a nightmare because people were like, where are you from?
It was hard.
What's your background? Like, and just the whole concept of school dinners and like sitting in the cafeteria, that like in my school back home, you had a tuck shop.
Yes.
And
you did cracking food.
Exactly. Yeah. But whereas like in the UK, it was like, okay, so you're going to have like custard and pudding, and it was just a weird thing.
It was a harder adjustment than I think any of us imagined. Like, I think maybe a year or two earlier, but 14 was about the right age. And I'm really glad I had time to do school before, and use school as a time to learn to be British before kind of coming up to university and then having to manage it on my own. But it was... I think the whole thing of immigration, we thought we are white South Africans, we're moving to England, like it wouldn't be a difficult transition, but there are a lot of cultural differences that do need navigating. So even when you're kind of moving with privilege, and I feel very privileged. My parents did a lot to get us out of South Africa. That wasn't an easy choice. And settling into England was not easy when you consider like the exchange rate and really what it took to get us here. But I don't suppose I recognized any of that until I was an adult, and you start to think about choices I would make right now. And actually my parents were probably the same age as me, when they were deciding that we had to move. It was brave. And I believe wholeheartedly it has given, myself, my sisters, the best opportunity that we could have had. And I think the way our lives have played out, it would have been different. In South Africa, I don't really know how we would have progressed. I don't know how my career would have progressed or the opportunities that would have been available to me.
It's fascinating talking to you because I'm hearing what you're saying and I'm thinking, gosh, that's such a reframe for me personally, hearing you say that school was like a practice run for university, because I have to be honest, I was bullied at school in the UK. I really struggled and I found it hard to make friends, but also I was from, I'm a person of faith, and I really struggled with coming to, in South Africa, it was okay to be like religious or a Christian, or to be into your grades, or to be into sport, or to be into drama and have activities outside of school.
Actually.
Well, it was kind of enforced. Like, yes. I don't know if you remember.
Mandatory.
Like, you had to do your mandatory cultural activity or sport activity.
After
and like,
school.
Yeah. And like, it was really normal for us. And then I think I moved to the UK and I found that there was sport, but it was only if you could afford it, or there were certain things that were free, but I found it really hard to navigate how to access that.
Different privileges, yeah.
I think so. I think for me, what you've said about the privilege of actually being able to move, I hadn't really thought about. I always thought, oh gosh, like we had such an amazing life and we left it all behind, but actually... And it was so hard when we came here, but what you're saying there is actually the privilege later. It takes time to kind of develop. I have to admit though, that kind of like coming to, I found it hard where people were maybe going and hanging out in the park with bottles of cider.
We didn't do that.
No, well, me either, but I found it strange.
Yeah.
Like I remember we couldn't wear makeup or
I'd never been to in South Africa, like I'd never been to a play park.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't a thing. And I had never been, out shopping with my friends without a grown-up supervising. I'd never been to a sleepover.
Yeah.
It was, a much more cautious lifestyle. And yeah, it took a bit of time to kind of adjust to the freedoms that England offered. But then also, I suppose there were some cultural differences, like drinking in a park, not really my vibe. But when you're 14, it's like, how do I stand up against this if it's not really what I want to do? I do think all in, because I have reflected a lot on, being an immigrant, which I know, almost sounds ridiculous but I am, I'm a foreigner. I was a foreigner. I'm now British. I have the passport. But kind of what that builds in you, it's not easy for anybody, even if you do move with privilege. But what it did prove to me, and it's something that I kind of come back to regularly, is that I've literally ended up in a foreign land and had to figure stuff out. And I did. And then when I was thinking about moving to university, this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm leaving home, and Lincolnshire's about 4 hours away from Newcastle. But I was like, I'll be fine. Like, I've moved to a new city before. I've done this before, and it might be difficult, but it will work out. And I kind of had the same talk with myself when I was going to set up the business. I was like, well, you've been somewhere completely foreign and uncomfortable, and you have no idea what you're doing, but you figured it out. And I kind of hold that as like a bank of proof that really I've navigated worse, I've survived worse, I've been more uncomfortable, and yet here I am, I'm still standing.
I love this chat because it's almost like I'm having my own therapy session.
You're
reframing
welcome.
all these stuff for me, which is great. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that I'm just thinking about. I mean, one of the things I'd like to ask you about is we grew up at the end of apartheid. So I know that we've both moved to the UK with privilege and experienced different versions of a parallel story. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is working with people across the African diaspora, whether it's in the States or UK or it's particularly creatives. Mm-hmm. And so I realized a few years ago, I was doing some activism and kind of trying to get involved a lot in race relations. And I realized that I was doing it because of apartheid guilt.
To kind of compensate.
And that had nothing to do with me. And it's really hard because that's our ancestral legacy in some ways. And we may or may not know what our ancestors were involved in. For instance, I think mine were missionaries. But if I trace some of my family...
Miners and fishermen.
Well, there you go. But some of mine, if I trace it back, it's like back to Jan van Riebeeck. It's like 3 generations back. So I'm sorry, not 3. It's several, you know. And I think what I'm trying to say here is I've realized that there is a thing around privilege where we need to own what we have and who we are, but also open up doors and use our platform to help others.
Absolutely.
I see you doing that all the time with the environmental stuff you do, using your voice to speak for the voice of nature, which is stunning. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I just wondered, had you also experienced that sort of shame?
I mean, well, kind of yes and no. So I think we're probably about the same age. We were born into apartheid. It was still a thing.
Yeah.
It didn't end until 1994, but that was I was 6 years old.
Snap.
So I didn't know that I was born into apartheid, and I didn't know that it was a thing because that's not really how my family are. I didn't understand that there was racial division. I didn't understand that there had been a history of cruelty. What I do really remember, though, is when apartheid ended. I remember, Mandela being this beacon of hope. I remember it ending. I remember people dancing in the street and the celebration. And the number one message was South Africa is going to be a rainbow nation. That's what he purported. And I think that was probably my first childhood understanding of what Africa was. It's a rainbow nation. And anything that happened before, I didn't really understand until I was a lot older, until they start teaching it at school and, you start educating yourself. But I think, again, this understanding that there was so much diversity that Mandela really encouraged everyone to celebrate, 11 official languages in South Africa, so many different tribal backgrounds, so much history, so much kind of crossover in cultures that, again, I don't believe I really thought that there was anything other than recognizing the value of diversity. And especially when you're thinking about the relationship between people and nature, that all of the, traditional African tribes and each culture and their relationship with nature and what they feel nature provides and how they respect it and their roles as stewards and, the responsibility that we have to look after the bush and wildlife, and understanding that fundamentally it is the root of our existence. If we don't protect nature, we undermine our own ability to survive and thrive. So it is something that I proactively seek, because I think with the complexity of sustainability and all of the problems that need to be solved, I think I've always valued ancient wisdom. That kind of, the tribes know the best way to look after nature because they've been doing it for generations. And that, connection, that relationship is so important to include in conversations about what the future looks like. So, I actively encourage, I actively welcome, immense diversity of opinions and thoughts and experiencing different cultures. I traveled a lot in my life. That's a privilege as well, and that teaches you a lot of stuff. You need to see other perspectives to understand your perspective and what it means in a global context.
100%. And you put it so beautifully about traveling to see other perspectives. I think you're right there. I mean, we are similar ages, and I was 6 in 1996. And I'm pretty sure when I looked it up recently, my school, when I've researched it recently, was one of the first to be integrated in terms of cultural diversity. And that was really interesting to me, that we grew up in the 90s and we hadn't had integrated schools, at least in Johannesburg anyway.
We didn't know any different.
No.
Because when we went to school, it was integrated.
Yeah.
I think, South Africa's an interesting subject all in its own right. I think there was, probably the decade after apartheid ended was maybe the grown-ups had to deal with the complexity of it a little more than we did. We were kids, we have our own problems, school's all consuming, none of what's happening in the real world really matters or affects you. But I think our generation of South Africans are the ones that then brought about the change, once that kind of first decade passed and they start looking at education and jobs and careers and, how to save the world. But with diversity in it.
Absolutely.
As a rainbow nation.
The way you've described that rainbow nation is just exactly how I experienced it. I remember watching people like you to vote and being dressed in such beautiful clothes. Exactly, but who had never had that opportunity before. So it's beautiful to hear of that. One thing I'm curious about is in your work and in all of the policies that you're involved in writing or researching, and even your incredible sustainability work where you did your Master's in Business Administration recently, executive MBA. Mm-hmm. What do you feel about this kind of concept of developing nations? So I really want to talk about this because we have a unique experience of growing up in a developing nation and moving to a developed nation. I sometimes think that there's some really beautiful values that get left behind.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, sometimes privilege kind of makes you not recognize the value of, what other people don't have. I think you can end up in a little bit of a bubble maybe. And it was the contrast. So, I do go home to visit my family. So I get kind of caught in a little bit of a Britain bubble, and I'm used to all of my luxuries here. And then I go back to South Africa and, then there's load shedding. We don't have electricity for 8 hours a day, or there's a massive storm and then there's no water for a couple of days, which incidentally happened while I was out there over Christmas. And it's perfectly normal. And weirdly, it's not something that I even blinked about. You don't bat an eyelid okay, this is just the new normal. This is the new normal. But I think it also goes the other way. I think that there are parts of South Africa that are sometimes more developed than the UK, and I think, well, they do it better. So maybe England has something to learn over here. I think the contrast between developed and developing nations in the conversation about sustainability is probably one of the most complicated and contentious issues. Developed countries, as they are, have, kind of benefited from the Industrial Revolution. That's where it all began. That's why we're developed. And we know that the Industrial Revolution is kind of the turning point for some of the climate change. Well, it is the turning point for climate change and some of the other sustainability issues that we experience. But there's always kind of this question of fairness in sustainability, this question of equity and equality. And, I can sit here and say, well, we have all of this privilege here. We know we need to fix the climate crisis, but how can we tell developing nations that they are not entitled to the same privilege, that they cannot create the same lives for themselves, that they cannot benefit from all of the, kind of advancement that we've benefited from, in the UK? And I think, again, that's why conversations about sustainability need that diverse input. One of the challenges that we have when we make decisions about sustainability, there's always this kind of fear of a rebound effect. So you kind of solve one problem here, but you create another problem over there. Climate change affects developing nations and marginalized communities and underrepresented communities much more than it does us. And we're feeling it, pretty bad. And I think sometimes you don't know what that effect is going to be unless you include those voices at the table. So again, just knowing what I know about kind of tribal attitudes to conservation is you need to think about, if we do this, who or what's going to be affected. And it makes it difficult because sometimes there's not always a good answer. Sometimes you are just looking at what's the least bad option, what's the one that would have the lowest effect on everyone, because an effect is still inevitable. But I think there's this balance that has to be, and how we do it, I don't entirely know. I think developing countries absolutely have a right to develop. And I think developed countries have an obligation at this point to check our privilege, check what is needed versus wanted and what decisions can be made to level the playing field, a more equal world. Maybe not just a rainbow nation, but a rainbow world would be delightful.
I love that idea. And here's where I guess we're going down our MBA kind of theory sort of stuff. But I would love to ask, there's lots of different agents that get involved in sustainability. So you may have your International Monetary Fund, or you might have all kinds of different organizations and groups. And what I'm curious about is, so if you have nations that have trade, import and export regulations on them, how are they supposed to develop? How are they supposed to grow outside of the prison that they're in sometimes financially? If you look at Jamaica, Nigeria, there's lots of countries that have restrictions or penalties on them for certain behavior.
I think on that point, it's because, and this is actually why the EDI conversation is so important, because we are getting better, but there is still an ignorance, maybe. I mean, again, this conversation in terms of how human rights fits into the bigger picture of sustainability, I believe they are one and the same. We are ultimately, sustainability is all about protecting the environment to look after humanity, and human rights are fundamental to a happy, healthy, existence, again, striving for that equality and that equity. But I think it's because there's still this kind of very small group of decision makers. It's probably a topic that's too big to unpack in this podcast, but the system is not really working the way it is.
Absolutely. But we require those conversations from within, so at grassroots level. And that's what I wanted to say about the agents and the different groups that are involved. We really need to give people who are in those areas the chance to speak for themselves.
Absolutely.
And there is that legacy of just making decisions for the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That needs to stop.
100%. It's also not as easy as just simply saying it needs to change. So there is a lot of opportunity, but also there are challenges as well. One of the things I wanted to comment on, because I also grew up in Zimbabwe, which I've seen change tremendously over the last 20 years. It was much more of a beautiful land with so much exported. When I go home, I'm surprised at how little is on the shelves and how much is imported and the cost of things. But one of the things I really wanted to say that I think is amazing when I go home is the enterprise of African people.
Oh, I love it.
And I'm talking about, you get off at the airport and you're driving to Harare and you see the people on the side of the road who have made the most beautiful beadwork, metalwork, using recycled glass, using recycled crisp packets, turning, creating wireframe giraffes out of crisp packets or cans, or, I have never seen such enterprise and upcycling. And I just think it's incredible. And I wanted to ask you about that, because that is something that blows me away every time I go home. It's just seeing that sustainable way of working.
It's weird because I notice it, I appreciate it whenever I go home, and I agree. I think maybe until this conversation, I had underestimated maybe how much that had influenced me, because that entrepreneurialism, is so African. There is so much creativity, but that's, sadly, it's, it stems from challenges. It stems from complicated lives. It stems from immense unemployment, immense poverty, and people just trying to find ways to look after themselves and feed their families. But this kind of unwavering ambition to keep going and to continue to find creative ways to do it, and at the same time to generally create really beautiful things. And I do actually think that's something I've known and seen my whole life, and maybe there is a seed of that again has transferred into my attitude, towards setting up a business. And I suppose not a fearlessness. I was absolutely terrified when I set up the business, but this kind of perspective that, if it doesn't work out, how badly wrong could it go? It probably wouldn't be the end of the world. You got to try, and you try. If it doesn't work out, you'll try something else. And I do think that is an inherently South African attribute. I see it in my family, who are also, now that I think about it, all very enterprising and entrepreneurial, and have, created jobs and careers and opportunities for themselves, and kind of forced us to think outside the box sometimes, but maybe that's not a bad thing.
I agree. I think resilience is key there. And I think back to that enterprise that we were talking about, it's almost a necessity because there isn't a national health service, or there aren't the opportunities that we have in the UK to gain healthcare or support or schooling, you know.
Benefits, yeah.
And so we are tremendously privileged to be here, but recognizing, you know, the people who really are thinking outside the box, the innovation that breeds when you need, and creativity that breeds when you need it, you know, and that's why I think it will keep us lean in our own organizations.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a bit about nature. There's so much happening in that space. I want to talk a bit about you and your entrepreneurial journey. Mm-hmm. So you founded Imvelo.
I did.
And can you tell us a bit about what Imvelo is and what it means?
So Imvelo is an environmental consultancy and training business, essentially. I set it up in 2015, very much naively thinking, oh, I really want to do this type of work, but no one will hire me. So how hard could it be? All I need is my brain and a laptop. It turns out it was a little bit harder than that. But I persist, you know, I'm still here, it's still going. Imvelo, its name is actually the Zulu word for environment. So that was like a little bit of a nod back to my African roots. And, you know, my branding is all very tribal. Weirdly, you know, being an environmental consultant when I joined was still quite a male-dominated sector. The businesses that I work with, manufacturing, construction, engineering, offshore renewables, waste process, they're all very male-dominated. And I had a lot of thought about, you know, how am I going to stand up? And I was like, I want hot pink. Like I don't want green. I don't want leaves. I don't want anything that looks like anything else. I want something that is kind of uniquely feminine, raw, you know, natural, but then also will stand up in these environments. And it kind of worked out. I specialize in helping businesses kind of develop their environmental management systems and sustainability strategies, but with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of it. So I specialize in the environment, but always environment as part of the triple bottom line. So people, planet, profit, and always, you know, that I think is where this conversation started, is that, well, I can't focus on the environment in isolation without thinking about impacts on society and impacts on the businesses in which I work. And similarly, I encourage my businesses to not only think about profit margins, but to expand into sustainability and EDI, and, you know, being positive forces in society. I then went on to set up another business.
Which is so brave, by the way. It's amazing.
Also mad. Not planned at all. None of this was planned. I never had dreams to set up my own business. That was not on my radar. It kind of just happened. But I think it is, you know, again, what you learn from immigrating, like an opportunity has arisen. Explore it, see where it goes. You know, you can always change direction. So yes, ended up developing a cloud-based solution, specifically around environmental legislation. I have a really incredible business partner, Matt Shaw, who is the practical side of this duo. So I kind of designed a thing. I was like, I think there's a software thing we can build. And Matt took all of my crazy ramblings and, you know, we built it, we made a thing. And that's been on the market for 3 years now, constantly evolving. Running a SaaS business versus a consultancy is a completely different kettle of fish. And I know absolutely nothing about it. I am learning as I go, but it's all very exciting. It's a different world.
I'm really excited about this for you because I think your environmental consultancy services are wonderful and they're going to touch so many organizations, and they already do. And you provide training and you really upskill a lot of organizations. But the opportunity for organizations to help themselves through your software as a service SaaS product, I think is just incredible. I wish we had more time. We could talk about being a founder as a female in tech. I mean, do you want to say anything about your investment journey? Have you aimed to seek investment?
We have not taken on any investment. That has been a conscious choice from our perspective, very much around wanting the autonomy to build this thing the way that we imagined it to be, but also thinking about how it would interact with organizations. So the SaaS product, the software is essentially all around environmental legislation. There's over 1,000 UK laws that fundamentally exist to protect the environment. A lot of them apply to business activities and operations, but it's complicated, it's difficult, it's ever-changing. The legislation website is not the most enthralling things to leave, and a lot of businesses, fall short of legislation causing pollution, but I don't believe it's intentional. I believe they just didn't know. So taking this perspective of compliance at a bare minimum, like if we can help businesses not break the law, then they won't be causing pollution. They'll be managing their risks. They'll be satisfying their employees and all of their stakeholders. But in doing so, in understanding all of the parts of the environment that are protected by regulation, they then also have a roadmap to do better. If water is such a significant issue for you, you've got all these laws you have to comply with, well, then water might be an area that you can go above compliance with.
So this is so valuable. So for anyone who's in an organization or who runs their own organization, they can actually use your tool to figure out where they stand from an environmental perspective. And then they have a roadmap of what to fix.
Absolutely.
I can see that being so useful from, I got an email actually from one of our clients the other day. They were a B Corp and they were saying, we need to do our annual ethical supplier checks. Yes. And can you fill in the survey and tell us where you are with this or what your policy is with that? I've never filled one of those in before, but I've also never thought of doing one myself. Mm-hmm. And I think there is much more of an appetite in procurement now to make sure you can prove social impact.
Well, weirdly, there's a lot of laws that are coming in that are forcing businesses to think about this differently. We've got the Social Value Acts, we've got procurement acts, we've got net zero as a, UK strategy. Like all of this is going to affect all of us in some way, shape or form. Legislation is the bare minimum. Like we've all just got to do that and then look for opportunities to do better.
Absolutely. It's an exciting time for the UK, but as you've said as well, there's also things we need to prepare for. There's one of the things we talked about offline before we started this was around choice. I know one of the biggest things coming to the UK that I really struggled with was the choice of cereal in the supermarket, bread,
mad,
and then I went to America, holy moly, the amount of, there was a whole aisle for Oreos, it was just and M&Ms, like the different flavors you can get. I just couldn't believe it. So choice is something that we've talked about before. So there is a lot coming around choice and how we can be more mindful of our choices.
Well, I think one of the kind of key messages from the TEDx talk that I delivered last year was around questioning our choice. Like, yes, we have lots of choice, but should we be taking advantage of all of it? Do we not have the choice to not buy into the choices? Could we live simpler lives? Could we have less options? Do we need 47 flavors of M&Ms? Probably not. One flavor, one bag would be enough. And again, the funny thing with choice is we've got to a point where we have loads of it. So going back and restricting our choices is going to be difficult. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be inconvenient. But the reality is that's probably what our not too distant future looks like. We should not have as many options as we do. Bring it back to the basics, bring it back to the fundamentals. Make it easier for all of us, because again, sustainability is one consequence of having too much choice, but also there's a lot of research about the impact it has on human health and well-being. We are overwhelmed with options.
And overstimulated.
And actually simpler lives, I feel, would be better across the board.
And this is what I find really ironic, because in some ways it feels like the developed nations look down on developing nations for having perhaps some more naive or less options, less choices, but actually perhaps they're onto something.
I believe so.
Yeah.
You don't miss what you don't know as well. That is true.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say we haven't had enough time to go into your your TEDx talk and the kind of content of it. But I do want to encourage anyone listening or watching to go and check that out, because your TEDx talk is so inspiring, and it's a deep dive into a lot of environmental changes and challenges coming. So I would love to say for anyone listening to go and check that out, because as well, there's some really great tips, hopeful tips to make a difference. So check that out. And then the last question I have for you is, what is your number one word to nurture your zest?
Number one word. Can I have a number one sentence?
Yes, of course. A lot of people are asking for phrases recently. Yeah.
So kind of one of the ways I try to approach entrepreneurialism, which, you know, has been quite a steep learning curve, is that I aim to work hard and rest hard. So I'm very good at managing my time. I block stuff out in my diary, you know, for meetings, for podcasts, for work, for clients. But I also make sure I block out time for rest. And that is what keeps me alive and what keeps me sane in this journey. Work hard, rest hard.
I think that's beautiful. And I just want to shout out very quickly to your hedgehogs, which is one of the ways you rest.
I rest hard with hedgehogs. Yes, I foster those in my garden. I've got a little girl in hibernating at the moment. So that brings me immense joy.
Yeah,
like immense joy.
I really loved meeting the hedgehogs recently. And I did want to say, did you have pregnant hedgehogs? You thought there was a mama?
I thought there was a mama. I didn't see anything, but, you know, nature will do what nature does.
Absolutely.
Just because I didn't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Exactly. Okay, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Ash.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to Nurture Your Zest today. If you're feeling extra kind, it would mean so much to me if you could share this episode with your friends or family, or anyone who you think might feel inspired by this content. Liking, sharing, or interacting with our content is a great way to support us as content creators, and it helps us to bring interesting stories and more people to you. This podcast is a Flamingo Heights podcast studio production, and I've been your host, Ashleigh King. If you liked today's episode, follow the video on your screen now, or check out the link in your show notes to find similar content.